Greetings, YouTube. Today I'd like to talk about my latest book, What Went Wrong? The Clash Between Islam and Modernity in the Middle East by Bernard Lewis. This book was an interesting read. I enjoyed it, but it was ultimately inconclusive, and that's basically because the author is discussing a subject which is frankly bigger than this book. It's an enormous topic. I had an interesting relationship to Islam. When I first encountered Islam, at least on a personal level in my head, when I first began to grapple with the concept of Islam as a cohesive faith, an organized religion, I did so from a historical perspective. I learned about Islam in its role in the Middle Ages, because I used to be, or am in many ways, a history junkie. And for me, Islam was always perceived as the faith that preserved the classical era, the faith that kept the Greek and Roman texts alive, and that after the Islamic State was expelled from Spain, that information was then disseminated to Europe through the translations done by Jewish scholars from Arabic and Turkish into European languages. So I had at worst a very neutral opinion of Islam and a slightly positive attitude about them. I viewed them in many ways as superior to the pervading Christian culture, because the Islamic faith had kept around the knowledge that helped to launch the Renaissance and eventually led to the Enlightenment, whereas I saw the Christian states as having lost that knowledge, having tumbled into the early Middle Ages, or as most people refer to them, as the Dark Ages. So when I saw Islamic states in the modern world having a conflict with the modern era, I was always confused, like, what happened? Where did they go wrong? Because I thought they would at best not slip back, that they would keep around the same attitudes that had allowed them to be this vessel of knowledge. But in some ways I shouldn't be surprised, because the Islamic states lost ground. And when you're in charge, it's easy to be tolerant, it's easy to be magnanimous when you think you're, large and in charge. But when you're backed into a corner, when you've lost ground, when you've been shown that your worldview is not the answer to all problems, it's harder to be tolerant. It's more difficult because you're on the defensive. And this book essentially dealt with that topic, about how the peak of the Islamic cultures was in the past, when they had expanded to their furthest, when they had controlled the most territory. And even though they still control, they're still greatly influential in many places, they don't have as much influence on the greater world as they once did. And they're introspective people, and they turned to different directions and asked, well, what did we do wrong? And they pursued military things. Okay, well, the Europeans have different military structures, let's pursue those, and they did. Well, they have different technical things, and they tried to pursue those. But what they didn't do is they didn't really pursue the heart of at least what I consider to be the key to why Europe has done so well, and that is the secular state, the democratic society. And part of that is because the very structure of Islam itself. The Jewish faith and the Christian faith are just that. They're religious beliefs that were and are laid on top of secular cultures. There have often been conflicts between the Jewish and Christian faiths and the cultures that they interact with. Don't get me wrong. and they have caused conflicts because of those faiths between nations. I'm not painting them with a broad brush and saying that everything's hunky-dory. I am not a fan of organized faith on any level, never have been. But when Muhammad founded Islam, it wasn't just a faith. He didn't just come up with a religious idea. He founded a nation. He was a leader in the secular and sectarian worlds. When he wrote down the Word of God, it wasn't just the Word of God about how you should live your life to protect your soul. It was about how to live your life in the world. He didn't just write a book about spirituality, he wrote a book about statecraft. So whereas the Jewish and the Christian organized religions can say they can have a separation of church and state, that doesn't exist in Islam. The Word of God is the Word of God. There is no separation. So because of that, the idea that you would have a secular and sectarian view of the world simultaneously is alien. And I think that's a detrimental situation for the Islamic nations. Because without that separation, I feel that it's going to be extremely difficult for them to really come to grips with the modern era. They're going to constantly be in conflict with those nations that have arrived at that conclusion. Because I feel that that separation of church and state is the key to the success, if you wish to call it that, of Western nations. And even the Eastern nations that are doing so well, like Japan is the second largest economy in the world. Another thing this book I found enlightening was the Quran stance on 3 classes of individuals which essentially are officially sanctioned prejudice. And those 3 classes are slaves, women, and non-believers. Now the Quran endorses slavery directly, which of course I'm opposed to, so that is a strike against the Quran. They also endorse women as a second-class set of citizens, though they do have certain rights within the Quran, such as property rights, that many Christian women did not have, and we have not achieved sexual equality in Western culture, and gender equality is something that we need to grapple with today, and we need to come to grips with in the future. And of course, Islam has always had a dim view of the non-believer, but then again, so has the Christian faith, requiring witnessing, requiring conversion, evangelical missionary work, and things like that. But I had never been aware that these 3 classes of second-class citizens, if you will, had been written into the Quran itself. My knowledge of Islam was not that detailed. So I found this book very interesting. It was an approachable read, ultimately inconclusive because the topic is so large. But if you were interested, it's not a huge book. It's not overly big. It's not an necessarily easy book. You need to really, get into it. It took me almost, I think, 2 weeks to read this rather slim volume. Whereas my last book, Dr. Screwdrivers, I read in 2 days. But I do recommend it, and I will probably be seeing if I can find something else by Mr. Lewis to see if he writes about other topics as well.